Of the several types of courage a man needs, one of the greatest, or the greatest, is the courage to decide to be pure. To be pure requires great manliness, great seriousness, great strength of will. I believe purity is a frequent miracle, but still a miracle. Quote from Plinio Correa de Oliveira. The Catholic Men's Podcast, Episode 23, Heroic Purity. Purity is a topic that is the elephant in the room for spiritual advisors to talk about to young men, but they seldom do. It is the thing that men struggle with in adolescence. The whole world and its entire entertainment system is against them, but it's taboo to say so. Uniformity with the world today means rejection of purity. To show young men that they're not alone in their heroic struggles for purity, I'm going to read some stories out of the Catechist by the Very Reverend Canon G.E. Howe. Depending on the story, these will either inspire you or shock you into practicing virtue. So whenever you're having hard times, you can just turn on this podcast and hopefully it'll help. This is The Catechist by the Very Reverend Canon G.E. Howe. The Temptation of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas of Aquinas, who, on account of his exceeding purity and sublime learning, is surnamed the Angelic Doctor, was inspired in his youth with the desire of devoting himself to the service of God in the order of St. Dominic, but had to undergo the most formidable opposition from his friends and family. Among other artifices, they sought to undermine his virtue, in order that, having once fallen into mortal sin, he might abandon the worship of God in disgust. With this view, they one evening introduced a wicked woman into his chamber, promising her a considerable sum of money if she succeeded in seducing him into sin. No sooner, however, had she entered the apartment than the holy youth, overcome with horror, snatched from the fire a burning brand, and, calling on God for assistance, drove her from the room. The Tempting Devils. A monk one day seemed to see two demons speaking together, and asking each other concerning the progress they were respectively making with two persons with whom they were trying to tempt. One said, "I'm doing very well with him that I have to deal with. I have only to present a bad thought to him, and immediately he takes to it and dwells upon it. When he finds himself surprised by that thought, he turns over in his mind all the ground it has gained there. He amuses himself with examining whether he resisted or consented, how it could have come into his mind, if he gave occasion to it, or if he did all he ought to have done to give none. In short, as often as I please, I torture his mind in this way, and put him almost beside himself. For me," said the other demon, "I am losing time with him that I am tempting. As soon as I suggest a bad thought to him, he immediately has recourse to God or the Blessed Virgin, or some saint, or else he turns his mind to something else, so I know not where to take him." By this way, we may see that the devil is very glad when we amuse ourselves reasoning on a bad temptation which he has suggested to us, for then he lacks neither will nor address to make it pass out of our mind to our heart. On the contrary, a good way to resist it is not even to want to listen to it, and not to make head against it, but immediately to turn the mind away from it without paying any attention to it. St. Teresa's danger. St. Teresa was a very good child. Now hear what she says about the harm which bad company did to her. "I would advise fathers and mothers never to let their children go into company which is not good. I know it from experience. The company of a girl who was a relation of mine did me much harm. I took great pleasure in being with her, in talking about her vain and foolish things, and in sharing her amusements. I found I had in me all the bad dispositions of my bad companion, and so I lost the fear of God. It happened that her father found out what was going on. He sent her to a convent, where she soon got back those good dispositions which she had laid aside when she was with her bad companion. How often children lose in bad company the graces which God gives to their early years." The Midnight Scream. There was a certain boy who went into bad company. He was taught by one of his wicked companions to commit a very wicked sin, which he never knew before. A year or two passed, and still he went on committing this sin. One night he awoke out of sleep. He began to scream frightfully. His people came around him to see what was the matter, and asked him why he screamed. They couldn't get any reply from him. They told him to pray. At last he spoke, and what do you think he said? "Woe," he said, "woe to that bad companion who taught me that sin. It is of no use for me to pray. I see hell open ready to receive me." With these words on his lips, he died. Saint Andrasia. Saint Andrasia, a maid of noble race and of great beauty, when her parents resolved on her marrying, betook herself to earnest prayer that God would render her countenance repulsive, that, being abhorred by men, she might the more easily preserve the fair lily of her virginity. Her prayer was heard, and soon her face was covered with sores, and overspread with a loathsome leprosy, so that, becoming hateful to her earthly spouse, she was left free to give herself to her heavenly bridegroom in the cloister. That there might be no doubt as to this disfigurement being bestowed as a safeguard of her virtue, God was pleased that she should recover all her former charms as soon as she had pronounced the solemn vow of perpetual virginity. St. Augustine at home. The father of St. Augustine, unable, notwithstanding his great wish, to meet the cost of his son's education, brought him home from school, until such time as he might be able to send him to Carthage to complete his studies. Augustine, therefore, at the age of 16, was obliged to remain at home, doing nothing. Then it was, as he admits, that idleness led him into the very depths of voluptuous pleasure. His holy mother, St. Monica, was terrified at the sight of her son's iniquities, and often urged him to quit them for the path of virtue. A reader of novels. During the course of a mission, a lady came to see one of the fathers who preached. She saluted him affectedly, making use of silly, exaggerated words. He easily knew from that the lady was in the habit of reading romance novels and other books of the kind. "I see that you read novels, madam." "I do, father, but then they do me no harm whatsoever. I merely read them for recreation." "It would be well for you in that case, madam, before reading one of these books, to kneel down and say to God, 'My God, I'm going to read these romances to please thee. I know there are bad doctrines in it, bad examples, and bad advice, but no matter. I'm going to read it to accomplish my baptismal vows, and to promote thy glory and the salvation of my soul.'" "But, father, I could never say such a prayer as that. It would be mocking God." "No, madam, if the book be good, you can and should say such a prayer." "But, father—" "Ah, there it is. You begin to feel that the book is not so harmless as you thought at first. Tell me, were you more pious formerly than you are now?" "Yes, father." "And did you read novels then?" "Oh, no, father, not at all." "Did you once prefer serious studies, useful work, and grave occupations?" "Yes, father." "And did you then read novels?" "No, father." "Were you once wiser and more obedient, less addicted to luxury and foolish expense?" "Yes, father." "And did you read novels?" "No, father." "You formerly frequented the sacraments with more relish and more exactness?" "Alas, yes, father." "And did you read novels?" "No, father." "Well, madam, I have nothing more to say to you. You see yourself the danger of reading such silly productions." Hubert and Louis. In a small town in France lived a young man named Hubert, whose piety and good conduct were an example to all persons of his age. It happened on one occasion that a public entertainment accompanied with fireworks, dancing, and other amusements was given in a neighboring village, and Hubert took a walk in that direction by way of recreation. On his way, he was joined by a young man named Louis, who was noted in the country for his immorality and impiety. Hubert, instead of making a civil excuse for quitting his company, weakly allowed himself to be drawn into conversation, and after they had talked for some time on indifferent subjects, Louis, following up his advantage, began to rally his friend on his piety and to paint to him the pleasures of a gay life in glowing colors. Hubert at first felt some displeasure at his conversation, but began to be ashamed of what his companion called a want of knowledge of the world. Having arrived at the fair, he was introduced by Louis to several wicked associates, and after visiting together the principal objects of attraction, the whole party entered into one of the booths to refresh themselves with wine. Heated with liquor, and inflamed by the wicked conversation of his companions, Hubert yielded to the tempter, joined in their dissolute conversation, and was led on to the commission of a still more grievous sin. Scarcely had he thus offended his God, when part of the building which had been erected for the occasion gave way, and the unhappy youth was buried beneath the ruins. Louis, who escaped, was so touched with remorse at the untimely fate of Hubert that he entered shortly after into a neighboring monastery, and spent the remainder of his life in the practice of the most severe penance. The bleeding crucifix. It is related in the life of St. Francis Borgia that a certain Spanish gentleman who was addicted to the sin of impurity was stricken in the flower of his age by a mortal distemper. St. Francis, having heard of the circumstance, was inspired by a holy zeal to make every effort to bring him to a sense of his sad condition and move him to repentance. Before going to visit him, he first went and threw himself at the foot of the crucifix, earnestly beseeching God to bless his endeavors and grant him the salvation of this unhappy soul. "Go," said our blessed Lord to him interiorly, "go to the sick man and exhort him to repentance. I promise you that my grace shall not be wanting." St. Francis set out on his errand of charity and obtained admittance to the sick man's bedside. In moving terms he represented to him the sad condition of his soul and exhorted him to make his peace with God by a good confession. But at the mention of confession the dying man turned away and declared that he would never consent to that. St. Francis returned home and, again throwing himself before the crucifix, earnestly implored our divine Lord to soften the hardened heart of the sinner. "Return to him," replied Jesus, "and take with thee the crucifix. Can he resist the sight of a God dead on the cross for his salvation?" The saint immediately went back to the dying man, and, showing him the crucifix, urged him in burning words to repent and confess his sins, placing all his trust in the mercy of God, who had shed the last drop of his blood upon the cross in order to save him. At the same moment, by a prodigy of grace, the sacred image appeared torn with wounds and covered with blood. Alas! The hardened sinner still remained insensible to the voice of divine grace. Having cast one look upon the crucifix, he turned to the wall and died in despair. The sight of impure sin. A father, seeing his son fall into impure ways, thought to cure him by taking him through the wards of a hospital destined for the shameful diseases. There he showed him the pains and sufferings which impure libertines had brought upon themselves and the wrecks they had made of their bodies and their careers. The sight of so many horrors had the effect of curing the young man of his evil inclinations. St. Bernard and the Robbers. St. Bernard, with some of his companions, was once on a journey, and when night came on, they went to a certain house to sleep. The landlady of the house was captivated by the appearance of Bernard, whose face reflected the innocence of his soul. She appointed for him a room not far from her own, that when the household retired to rest, she might be able to go and converse with him. When all were in bed, the door of his room was gently opened, and the lady of the house went in. When Bernard saw her in the room, he immediately began to suspect the reason of her coming there, and, raising his heart to God, he prayed for his grace to overcome the temptation. Suddenly he cried out as loud as he could the words, "Thieves! Thieves! Robbers!" As soon as she heard these words, the audacious woman fled. But the people of the house all rose in haste and armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, and ran about the whole place in search of the thieves. After a fruitless search of half an hour, they returned each to his own room and tried to compose themselves to sleep. The same thing happened a second and a third time, and with a similar result. When the little company had resumed their journey, the companions of St. Bernard asked him what he meant by crying out so often during the night and alarming the whole house. They thought that he surely must have been dreaming all the time. "No, dear friends," he answered, "it was all too true. There was a robber in the house. Our hostess was the robber, and she wanted to rob me of a treasure which I esteem more than all of the treasures of this world, the treasure of holy purity. Thanks be to God, I escaped. I overcame the temptation." St. Eudocia's conversion. At the end of the 1st century, there lived a young woman who was famous for her great beauty and charms, and whose life was one of great sin. So great was the reputation she had gained for evil that it was commonly said that she had been the cause of more iniquity than any other evildoer in the country. Eudocia, for that was her name, was living in this kind of life when it pleased God to call her, like another Magdalene, to a life of sanctity. One night she was lodging in a house which stood close to a monastery. It was late, and the traffic of the day being ended, a stillness hung over the city. As the night was calm and beautiful, Eudocia sat near the open window of her room. Suddenly she heard a sound as of someone reading. She listened. It came from the neighboring monastery. It was the custom in that holy house, as elsewhere, for each one of the monks to read a pious book every night before retiring to rest. And it happened that one of them, whose cell was nearest to the house where the woman lodged, thinking himself quite alone and that no one was near, read aloud from his book. Eudocia listened at first with some curiosity to find out the subject of which he read. It was a meditation on the eternal torments of those who die in mortal sin. The poor woman began to tremble as she listened to the terrible description read by the unknown voice, and when the monk had finished and retired to rest, happy in the thought that he was not conscious to himself of any grievous sin, Eudocia also lay down in her bed. But she couldn't rest. The fear of the terrible judgment of God upon sinners drove sleep away from her eyes, and she was tossed to and fro all the night in terrible agony. As soon as it was morning, she went in search of a priest who might instruct her in the mysteries of the true faith. He received her with kindness, and ordered her to lay aside her evil garments and renounce her evil companions. Then he instructed her in the truths of the Christian religion. Eudocia received baptism from the hands of the bishop, and from that moment her life was a model of Christian virtue to all. Practice of St. Philip. St. Philip used to say that Holy Communion and devotion to Our Lady were the only means for a young man to remain good and pure. A student who was addicted to impure sins went to consult the saint, who made him return again and again to confession after his falls, and then to communion. And by this frequent reception of the sacraments, always carefully received, the young man was at length cured of his evil habit, and in time was thought fit even to be promoted to the priesthood. St. Jerome studying Hebrew. St. Jerome had had the misfortune, in his early youth, of contracting bad habits. But no sooner was he baptized, that is to say at the age of adolescence, according to the custom of that age, that he set about correcting himself. Do you know what was the means that succeeded best with him? It was to work much. He began to study, to read, to copy books, all the while practicing the exercises and the virtues of a solitary in the desert. The sin that he found it hardest to avoid was precisely that of the sixth commandment. Nevertheless, he was not discouraged. He seemed to say to the demon of impurity that tempted him every day, "Ha! Thou wilt not leave me alone. Though I fast, give myself to the discipline, ruin my health with all manner of austerities, thou dost still pursue me? Well, I know how to subdue thee." He succeeded at last, and do you know how? Still by work. To the studies he had already undertaken, he added a new and not a very easy one. He began to learn Hebrew. It was an old Jew who had taught him, and after a while he became himself so well versed in the language that he translated almost the whole Bible into Latin, which was rendering a great service to the Church. Let us do like him. When we are tempted, let us work hard. If the temptation continues, let us work still harder. If it be obstinate, let us be obstinate in working, and all will turn to good account for us. The young solitary. A young solitary did not employ his time as conscientiously as he ought to have done. In consequence of this, he was frequently idle, and during these idle moments he was often tempted with impure thoughts. One day, when he was tormented more than usual with them, he went to his superior and told him about it. The superior, who knew the young monk's disposition to idleness, said he would try to cure him, so he at once gave him much more constant labor and more heavy work than he had been accustomed to, and commanded him to accomplish it without delay. A few days afterwards, the superior, meeting him alone, asked him if he were still troubled with the temptations he had complained of to him. No, he replied. How could I find time to be tempted, since you have imposed on me so many and such continual labors? I have not even time to breathe. In this way also will those Christians who are tempted in the same manner be effectually cured, if they only adopt the same means. Well, those are all the stories I'm going to read from the Catechist today, but just remember there are a lot of other amazing stories in the book, so if you ever find this book for sale, go for it. It's an amazing read. So the final thought to walk away with is that if you're ever feeling tempted, just remember that you're not alone, and take heart. Thanks for listening. Godspeed.